Hello, friends. Hello, friends, and welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology. I'm Henry Seltzer, and we want to talk about this new moon that's coming up tomorrow, actually late tonight, 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning on the West Coast, Friday morning. So let's go ahead and look at the chart, first of all. And I think you should see the chart in front of you now, hopefully so. Well, you know, we've been saying it's like a broken record. These lunations have all been so powerful, and this is no exception. There is not all three of the outer planets like there usually is in these, but we do have a powerful presence of Pluto, Neptune, and Aries in this chart. And I'll try to show you how we can see that manifesting very clearly when we look at the angles between these planets. And we want to talk about, of course, also the Mercury retrograde, which is already finished up as of late last month, but as it turns direct, it still has to recover its lost ground. You know, it moves backwards through the zodiac, in this case through the last part of Pisces. And as it moves backwards, it recapitulates the same degrees of those 15 degrees or so that it has occupied before, but then when it turns direct, it goes over it a third time. And sometimes what they say about transits, applying to like a Pluto transit, is stop, look, and listen. And the understanding there is, it's a little shorthand, a little mnemonic device, but the shorthand understanding there is that when we first pay attention, well, we're first not paying attention actually, but when we first get a transit like a Pluto transit coming across our, let's say, sun, and then it might back up across the sun again and a third time across the sun. The first time we might stop in our tracks and say, what's going on? Something is happening here. Do I understand it, Mr. Jones? And maybe not. And then stop, look, and listen. Take a closer look as it happens the second time and really begin to listen to the message the third time around. And that's kind of what we've got going in the last part of Pisces. So anybody that has planets in the last half of Pisces after the 15-degree mark is surely going to be feeling it in this past few weeks. You know, the few weeks of the retrograde, which was from pretty close to the beginning of March, around the 5th of March, about a month ago, until the timing of the station of the Mercury retrograde, which was the 28th of March. So during that time, it moved gradually backwards from a conjunction that it was making with Neptune right in mid-Pisces, as you can see right here. 15 degrees is the new moon, 17, 18 degrees is the current position of Neptune in Pisces, and also Mercury. So Mercury's back there again. So it came almost very last degree of Pisces before turning around the beginning of March, coming backwards, until it intersected once again with Neptune. And the interesting thing about that intersection, I think maybe most of you know this, maybe not, is that as it intersected Neptune, it was still moving backwards, but very slowly, about to turn around. And then as it got just a little bit past Neptune, not even a whole degree, it turned around, and then, by George, it was in a positive, that is to say, forming conjunction with Neptune, less than a degree, and then crossed the actual degree of Neptune, and then was still within the degree, you know, a partile conjunction with Neptune for quite a while afterwards. So we had this kind of amazing coda over the 28th of March through the 2nd or 3rd of April, where Mercury in its station, in its slow-moving station, which makes it much more significant because it is moving so slow, just like an outer planet at that point. It was also interacting with Neptune on the way backward, forming its conjunction, then going a little bit past Neptune, stationing direct within a degree of Neptune, and then moving forward again and stationing Neptune yet again. So we have really this very strong Neptunian in Pisces, right? So it's already Mercury in Pisces. So this very Neptunian Mercury that we've had ever since really the whole month of March, and then the next 3 days of this month, the following 3 days after March, the first 3 days of this month. So it's been, I think it's been a rather remarkable Mercury retrograde. I know a lot of people have expressed that to me. And I could ask you, how are you feeling about this time that has just passed? I think it is, to me, it's a very significant time because we're not really used to being so involved with Neptune. Neptune is definitely an otherworldly archetype that comes into our awareness in sort of peripheral ways. The Grateful Dead lyricist Robert Hunter puts it, you have to close your eyes to see, because this is something that is operating beyond the physical, on other planes of existence, where things are much more close together. You know, that's where we get this idea that there's no such thing as a coincidence, no such thing as an interaction between two people that is not actually a meaningful interaction for some purpose. We don't always know the purpose. Sometimes we can guess what the purpose might be as it brings us closer to understanding what we're about, what we're here for, what our life purpose is. And that is really the message of these interesting lunations recently, because we have such a strong presence also of Eris. Now, Eris is at the 23-degree mark of Aries, where it's been forever, because it moves a couple of degrees back and forth, but it only moves a quarter of a degree net forward each year right now, because it's going very slowly the furthest away from the sun it is now, which is in the sign of Aries. And so mid-Aries, or a little bit past mid-Aries, we have the new moon in Aries, 15 degrees, as you can see, and we also have Eris close by at 23 degrees and making an aspect, a trine aspect, quite close with with Jupiter up here. So that is in 24 degrees of a fire sign. That's a perfect trine, about a degree off, and making this square between Aries and Capricorn. Pluto is at 23 degrees of Capricorn. Pluto is moving very slowly now. Pluto is about to station at this same 23-degree mark. It only gets to about 23 degrees in 9 minutes, a few more minutes, before stationing on April 24th. And all that time, Pluto's in a close square with Eris. So what does that tell us? It definitely brings Eris into prominence. Another thing we might note in this particular new moon configuration, it's very interesting and important to recognize these declinational aspects. So I will take a minute to mention this, that if you right-click on the moon, you see that the moon is actually contraparallel with Eris. And in the time passages software, you can easily see the parallels and the contraparallels, including the transiting parallels if you had a transit bi-wheel up, by right-clicking on the planet. So if I right-click on the moon, I see it's 1 degree and 26 minutes, about 1.4 degrees. If I right-click on the Eris point, 1.8, so 20 minutes. This is 1 degree 46. 20 minutes of a degree, or a third of a degree off. Still very close. Within a degree is considered a close parallel or contraparallel aspect. So it just basically illuminates Eris even more in this particular new moon, because the very new moon itself, the moon, is making that strong aspect to Eris, as well as the square to Pluto, as well as the trine to Jupiter. So we have quite a lot going on here. And what we did have before we had this Eris Pluto, this Eris with Pluto, is we had Eris with Uranus, but that's kind of sort of beginning to be over with now. Although they say that this aspect lasts till 2020, as a matter of fact. But before we had Uranus way back here in Aries, they were conjunct at about the same degree, about the 23-degree mark. In different parts of its 2-degree back and forth cycle, it occupies 23, 24, 22. So it's at a further stage now. And so actually it will go beyond this when it moves forward again, once it does, as it moves forward now. It's in direct motion now. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that there was a big conjunction between Eris and Uranus in the 2016 time frame. It was the summer of 2016, it was exact. Also March of 2017, and we saw during that period of time so much revolutionary activity, so much surprise events with Uranus and Eris combined. Just one after another of revolutionary events. It was a revolution in the Republican Party that Donald Trump became the candidate, and that he got so much popular approval, and that he eventually won the election. These are all kind of surprise events. The call for the election was that Hillary Clinton would win, and that didn't happen, as we know. And so, and of course, then the first few months of the Trump presidential situation, too, we've had surprise after surprise after surprise, including revelations that there was some kind of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians, which is still being debated, and the Mueller report has just come out. So we have a lot of that activity is waning, but still active. But now we have with Pluto. So with Pluto, we're seeing deep change. So we have seen some change in the political system in the United States with the 2018 elections, because there was a turnover there of the some of the party politics. I won't go into a lot of detail. And then we have in our individual lives as well, recognition of what we're really all about precedes deep change, does it not? I mean, that's really the whole story, isn't it? Where we're coming from, how we perceive the world, how we perceive our place within it, how we perceive right action, how we perceive what we need to do, how we perceive what we cannot not do. This is all what is part of the Aries message, that you have to take a stand for your deepest values, whatever it is that you cannot avoid acting upon, especially once you know more about it, once you understand where your mission lies, where your purpose is. And musicians know this. They found their niche. They found what they needed to do was to play music, and by George, that's what they do, and everything falls second to that. And other people too, you know, artists, people of all kinds that are dedicated to their lives. It might be for helping people, it might be for establishing a new institution or enhancing the existing institutions, whatever it might be that you feel called to do. And only your own intuition can tell you this, right? Whatever that is, the timing is to act upon it. And we have a lot of aids to that because there's deep intuition happening right now. Ever since we've had Uranus in Taurus, that's been a new thing. That's been a way of really getting into the message of the body, isn't it? Taurus refers to earth energy, refers to the body. Uranus refers to a deep process of intuition that, again, just like Neptune, goes beyond what we have in the normal physical planes of existence. So that's one place we're tuning into it. And even though Uranus is not emphasized in this new moon, it's definitely emphasized in the full moon, which follows, which, as you know, has always been right around the beginning degree of each sign, successive signs. And this next one is, guess what? Right near the beginning degree of Taurus. It's actually in the last degree of Aries, and the opposition of that, the last degree of Libra as well. But anyway, that is going to illuminate very much so the Uranus, which is still a factor here. And basically, Neptune is obviously strong, being connected to some extent to this new moon, because in the middle point of its sign at the 17 degree mark, so it's only a couple of degrees separating them from a 30 degree aspect. And then it's also, let's see, we can right click on it. It is contraparallel to the sun as well, along with Mercury. So Mercury and the sun and Neptune are all tied together, as well as Mercury also being involved in this square it makes with Saturn, which is another factor, which is a huge factor. So we have Mercury, Neptune, and Saturn involved. as Mercury begins to straighten out and gain ground going through, though, it's for the third time, this last degree of Pisces. We'll want to pay attention to when it crosses into Aries, which is around the middle of the month. It's, I think, the 15th or the 16th of the month. And when it does do that, it will have left behind its retrograde shadow, and that is really considered to be the time when you really kind of get a fresh start with new perspectives that you've gained during that past period of time when Mercury was retrograde. So that's something to look forward to as well. Although then, when it does cross into Aries, we have also the conjunction between Mercury and Chiron sitting here at the beginning of Aries. And then we also have, of course, the new moon on the 19th, which is a few days after that, which will illuminate both Uranus and Chiron. So basically what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of woods that we're working our way through, and this doesn't mean a terrible thing. You know, sometimes astrologers get confused about this, and sometimes people that are trying to tune into astrology get confused about this, that maybe Saturn is a difficult transit. And sure it is. It's a maturation process, and maturation is not easy. It's like saying, oh my God, I wish I hadn't have gone through those teenage years and those early 20s when I was maturing and I was trying to find my sense of responsibility. Well, guess what? You had to go through that, right? You had to go from where you were to where you become. And so that's a process, and it's all positive. I mean, there's no such thing as a bad planet. difficult transit, there may be a difficult transit, but there's no such thing as a bad transit because it's all for the purpose of getting you a little bit more situated, a little bit further along your evolutionary path of greater understanding, greater integration of your parts, greater understanding of what it is you're up to and where you can put your shoulder to the wheel and really apply your efforts. So I think that's the essence of what this new moon configuration is about. A lot of Saturn. Remember that Saturn and Pluto are still in close parallel to each other. Again, you can right-click and see 21.5, 21.7. Close parallel there, also involving Mars, by the way, also involving Jupiter. So this is a pretty strong configuration too, suggesting that what we have is a structural transformation that's going on, that the whole structure of the society is altering. And is this not the case? Can we not see this? That there's a question of the institutions, a questioning of the institutions, a question of whether the institutions can be revived and made more viable in this time, so that they don't fall apart and so that we don't have the misuse of our institutions, to put it bluntly. So there's the whole thing that's happening there with a regeneration and progressive versus conservative viewpoints. And the conservative viewpoint is represented by Saturn. Progressive viewpoint is represented typically by Uranus, also by Neptune to some extent, because what is Neptune really about? It's about seeing an idealistic vision of what life could be like. We talk about fantasy, we talk about escapism, we talk about illusion and confusion with Neptune, because it really is off this physical plane, and so it's like you only have one foot on the ground or even one toe on the ground if you're really involved with Neptune. And maybe that's the way our thinking process has been over these last few weeks, and especially this last week or so, when there's been so much Neptune and Mercury in the combinations. But even now, as Neptune is sitting here making some aspects and just sitting in the middle of Pisces, there's definitely a lot of Neptune in this configuration, and there has been. So all this time we've been trying to integrate Neptune, trying to integrate our ideals, trying to integrate our poetic imagination and our vision for what could be possible as we dream big, right? And see if we can integrate that with what's here in the physical, here and now, which is represented by Saturn. So Mercury pulling these two together, being in a close square, 18 degrees, 42 minutes, close square to turn at 20 degrees and almost nothing. So, we're a degree and a half apart. Of a perfect square. I'm sorry, not a square, is it? That is not a square, that's a sextile. That's what I meant. So that sextile between Mercury and Saturn, and also bringing Neptune into the picture because of the conjunction with Neptune. And sextiles are openings. Sextiles are a chance to see a new pattern beginning to emerge and to be able to seize upon that possibility, which we have a lot of that going on too. So it's all very exciting, including the fact that these new planets, Haumea and Makemake, are in the act. We noticed, for example, that Haumea at 25 degrees of Libra is pretty close to an opposition of this 23-degree mark, and they're both coming toward each other because Aries is still going forward until it will station in July at the 24-degree mark at that point, and then move backwards. And as it moves backwards through 2020, through early 2020, it will once again have that square, that perfect square with Pluto, because Pluto also goes back, just as Aries goes off the 23-degree mark forward, Pluto goes backward, but then they will rejoin when Saturn and Pluto conjoin in early January of 2020, early 2020 in January is what I'm trying to say. They will be Saturn and Pluto in conjunction. We know that later on that year there's going to be that triple conjunction. We'll have Saturn with Jupiter coming up to join, and then the Saturn with Pluto, triple conjunction with Pluto, and then there will be the Saturn and Jupiter conjunction right at the very beginning degree of Aquarius. So bringing the whole notion of Aquarius, age of Aquarius, a new way of being in the world, because this will be the first conjunction in air signs. Everything has been in earth signs for the past couple hundred years. So that will be the first conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in air. So that's a significant moment, and that's why astrologers have been talking about 2020 for some time now. as a big turning point in the culture. And so we'll see what we will see, and we'll see how it affects us on an individual level. And the fact that Aries is forming opposition with Haumea brings Earth energy into the picture, because these two new planetary archetypes, Haumea and Maki, named after indigenous gods and goddesses, are actually harbingers of being able to work with nature in a much more direct way, as the indigenous societies all were forced to do because they live so close to nature. We've gotten away from that, haven't we, in our so-called civilized societies, and it's time for return to the fundamentals and really tuning back into nature as a spiritual path, and that's becoming more and more prevalent in the culture and the zeitgeist right now. And that will continue, especially when we see this opposition forming between the positions of Haumea, quite slow moving, slower than Pluto, and also Aries, quite slow moving, right now going very slow because so far away from the sun, taking, over 120 years to go through Aries, so that's 1/4 of a degree every year on average. So I think that says most of what I want to say. Maybe we should take a break from me talking all the time and see if we've got questions. Leslie Benson is here with us and has some questions to relate to you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here with us today. And yes, we have some questions. The first we'll take from Juanita, and she's here with us on Facebook, asking, how will the upcoming Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn have an impact on us all?
Oh, there you go. I was just mentioning that. Well, Saturn and Pluto together, several things. Tarnas talks about it in his wonderful book, Cosmos and Psyche. He talks about various outer planet combinations, and he talks about Uranus-Pluto, which was the harbinger of the 60s and even of the 20 teens, because it's in its opening square from that first conjunction in Virgo in the 1960s, which characterized that time of great revolutionary turnover. Well, we have Pluto-Saturn. It's a little different than Pluto-Uranus, because Uranus is all about the future and doing things a different way and being open to possibility. Freedom from the known, Uranus was called. But Saturn is more about the here and now, and that really relates to the world wars that we've had. And when you see those combinations, it relates to also the Saturn-Pluto opposition, which was right across the U.S. chart. Guess when? On 9/11, September 11th, 2001, we had Saturn and Pluto in opposition. So now this is the next conjunction. Now, the previous conjunction to the Saturn-Pluto opposition of 9/11, which is right across the ascendant-descendant of the United States chart in one of the very popular renderings of the U.S. chart from July 4th, 1776, which I have it up so I can actually show it to you. Maybe I'll just bring it up. So here's the USA chart, and this is rectified by Dane Rudjar to 5:13 p.m., 5:14 p.m., approximately, LMT. This was somebody at the time, Sibley, a famous chart called the Sibley chart. This is a variation of it. Anyway, always has Sag rising, which makes sense because the American character is so much of the exploration of further frontier, right? That's what America's all about in a certain way, which is what also Sagittarius is all about. And you even have the image of the cowboy riding into the sunset on his horse. So if you look at this chart, and if we look at transits to this chart, and if we edit the transit date, and we put in 9/11, and I'll just leave 8 a.m., that's about right. It's not quite right. It was about 5 a.m. on the west coast here. You can see that Pluto had just crossed the U.S. ascendant at 12 degrees, whereas Saturn, this is the whole Saturn-Pluto opposition of that summer, was just on the U.S. descendant. So you have it right across the ascendant-descendant of the United States chart. You have Saturn and Pluto in opposition. And I started to mention that the previous conjunction preceding this opposition was in 1981. And when we had this event and we felt like it was this terrorist attack upon the American institution, the American presence in the world, and we thought it was to some extent the chickens coming home to roost from all of the more or less state terrorism that had been practiced by the United States in Central America, for example. There was the Iran-Contra scandal in the 1980s, which was the Reagan administration, and they had found a way to find money even though it wasn't allowed to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. They had found a way to get extra money that was not on the books and sent that to the Contras because they were trying to foment rebellion in Nicaragua against the socialist regime of the Sandinistas that had just come into power there. I think I have that history right. So 1981 is very interesting when you regard that as also the very first year of the Reagan administration. Reagan came into power riding on a kind of a backlash against over liberalism, perhaps. And there was this conservative wave, and there was trickle-down economics, and there was this idea that just allow the capitalism to flourish and allow the capitalist financiers and oligarchs to flourish, and that would create a better economy for everybody, and that was where we were at that time. So you could call it conservative empowerment, Saturn-Pluto, and we have it coming up again in January, so we could call that the conservative empowerment that we are seeing all around us, because there is this kind of large faction in America that wants to see restoration of conservative values. And you know, the pendulum swings back and forth. We can't go too far, they would say, in the liberal direction without giving the whole show away, and so we have to pull back and be more conservative and more careful in our physical financial arrangements. So that is all in play when we come to this next conjunction, which we can also, by George, we can put that right in here too. I'll just say the 15th. January 15th, 2020. And here you can see that it will be around the 23-degree mark. Pluto being at 2253. I'm just picking a random date. I didn't do a very good date here. It's not the perfect exact conjunction. It's just a little bit after it, so it is right at the beginning of the year that we have that. And we see also that Eris at 23 degrees of Aries is still by George in square with this conjunction. So it's very interesting that Eris plays a big part in this, the transiting position of Eris. And then we would want to see, well, how does this hit the U.S. chart? And the answer to that is it's very much hitting the Mercury in the U.S. chart, which is media. You know, if you look at a national chart, you're not looking at individual characteristics like people being talkative or being able to clearly articulate their viewpoint, which would be Mercury and thought process. You're also talking about, with the national chart, you're talking about the thought process of the nation, the communication of the national situation. And that is very much involved, obviously, with the media and with punditry and with the pundits on one side lining up in a big chorus line against the pundits on the other side lining up in their big chorus line. So we have this debate that's constantly going on right now, and it's it will only get exacerbated in the timing of January 2020. There's no doubt whatsoever about that. And you know, if we take a look at the transit date and we take it back, reel it back into our current times, you know, when we look at, we're in April, and this is the 5th that we're talking about, early in the morning of the 5th. And so here we see the, I think we do. Oh, I didn't do that right, did I? No, I had the wrong year there. So here we see the new moon, 15 degrees of Aries. And how does that new moon hit the U.S. chart? Well, the interesting thing, to me it's quite interesting, is that the Saturn in the U.S. chart is at 14 degrees 48 minutes of Libra. And do we have attention being paid to the executive branch? Do we ever in this timing? So, I mean, we're seeing a lot of revelations coming down, including supposedly the Mueller report, which may eventually become released, and people saying one thing or another about it, and finally a leak about what was in the Mueller report. Anyway, all this is in play. We don't want to talk politics here, but it is fascinating to see that this new moon is exactly opposite. Saturn in the 10th house, what you would think of as the executive. We have a strong executive in this country, and the national chart, which we can also show here, just to show the chart itself, does have Saturn right here in the 10th house in a perfect square pretty much with the sun. So, I mean, this is a very strong position of Saturn in the chart and in the 10th house representing the executive. So we do have a strong executive in this country. And I don't know if that rambling answer there, I believe I touched on some of the themes that you were concerned about. Certainly, Saturn-Pluto does involve a certain dire situation. It involves structural change, massive structural change, and we're seeing the beginnings of that now. And it does involve also taking a conservative viewpoint and magnifying that to be the way we do things. In other words, tread carefully. This is not the time to go shooting off in all new directions. This is a time to rein things in and be very concerned about just making it through and somehow surviving the situation that we're in, which is a rather dire transformational factor. You know, so we're seeing that new cycle that, similar to the previous cycle, began with a certain conservative empowerment. We're seeing that cycle beginning in January 2020. We may very well see that the Republicans and the conservatives are doing quite well, in spite of the fact that there's a lot of revolutionary fervor on the side of the progressives at this time. We also have a strong presence of Uranus, so there is this tug of war going on between Uranus-Neptune and also Pluto-Saturn. So I think that's about all I can say on that for the moment.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have a few different questions about retrograde planets. One is from, I'm going to give them both to you because they're related, okay?
Okay, retrograde planets.
One is from Millie. What does it mean when you were born during Jupiter and Mercury retrograde? That's one.
Okay.
And then another is from Steffi. What does it mean when someone is born with Neptune and North Node retrograde? And then we have Priscilla here with us on Facebook wondering if retrograde planets are related to difficult life lessons.
I don't think so particularly, to answer the last question first. We have to distinguish between inner and outer retrogrades. Inner planets, when they retrograde, it's quite a significant departure from the normal activity. For example, a Mars retrograde would be much more introverted in its activity. In other words, the activity is directed inward. It may be bringing the kettle to a boil. It may be an evolutionary process that's going on that may be an internal, largely internal process. It doesn't mean it's not active. It just means it's active in an internal way. Now, Mercury direct is, I'm talking about Mars. Mars direct is the more common, but, you know, in a natal chart, you might find a retrograde Mars, and that does mean they're more of an inner character. Similarly with Mercury, Mercury is normally direct 3 times a year for 3 weeks at a time or for 5 weeks at a time, counting the shadow. It does turn retrograde, and if you're born during that time, supposedly you're not only a little bit more inward oriented, you're a deep thinker, you're somebody that's introspective, literally, perspective to the internal side, but you're also supposedly able to survive a Mercury retrograde period of time without much ruffling of your feathers. In other words, you are somebody that just normally expects things to be slow and thoughtful, and that's the way it is, and you just understand that, and you don't have, it's like, you know, they say that the paranoids in the burning building when the insane asylum burns down are the ones that are the most successful because they can guide everybody to safety because they were expecting this all along. That's a little bit of a joke, but it's a little bit of a truism. Now, the inner planet retrogrades is one thing. Outer planet retrogrades are much more common, 6 months out of the year, basically, as long as the Earth is moving past them in that direction versus the other direction, you see. They are not quite 6 months, but they are in retrograde motion, and it does imply that the action of the planet takes place on a more internal level. That would be like, for example, Neptune. Neptune being a planet of dreams and of unconscious process, that would be very strongly activated. I mean, it's not that different from Neptune direct. Most important is the aspects that Neptune makes to the other planets in your natal chart. That's going to really tell you where Neptune is active in the house position, where Neptune is active in your life, in your chart. And then the fact that it's retrograde adds a little flavoring to that, but it's not a hugely significant factor. It certainly would not be a great difficulty compared to just dealing with Neptune to begin with, because when you have a strong Neptune, you have all this idealism, you tend to go for fantasy, escapism, movies, any way that you can not be so closely tied to the real life physical situation, and you can get away for drugs, for example, you can get away from it. And that's the thing that's hard to deal with, not whether it's retrograde or not, but how strong it is in your chart. Now, as far as the south node or the north node, those do move retrograde. If you're talking about the mean nodes, they're always in retrograde motion because they tend to go backwards. They move the way the orbit interacts, the way the moon's orbit interacts with the plane of the ecliptic. They move backwards through the zodiac as you see them against the pattern of the zodiac and the beyond the positions of the planets, the reference point of the zodiac. They're always moving retrograde. So they sometimes, if you're talking about the true node, they sometimes move a little bit direct and then turn retrograde and a little bit direct. But the tendency, the overall movement is retrograde motion. So that's just normal. To see a node moving backwards is not anything at all. So I think that sums up retrograde planets. Certainly when Mercury is retrograde in the sky, we do have this transiting situation, which is quite different from the normal Mercury just flitting along, moving more than a degree a day, moving a couple of degrees a day, just moving past everything, sailing along and doing its messenger of the gods kind of thing, flitting around and making us aware of all different perspectives all the time. But when it's retrograde, it gets more deep and more introverted and more of a, let's try to find out what's really going on, what the underlying motivation is. So that's why we talk about the Mercury retrograde so much, so everybody gets so involved in it.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question is from David, who is here with us regularly. Welcome back, David. Thanks for being with us. He asks, for a while now, the South Node has been near Pluto and Saturn in Capricorn. On April 24th, Pluto will station retrograde and the South Node will have transited conjunct Saturn before Saturn's station retrograde on April 29th.
Good.
In some people's charts, Pluto and Saturn will have been having contacts with the natal chart points for a while, and during their retrograde periods, they will reconnect at least once with those natal points. Newly painted with the fateful, South Node energy and destined, at least in Saturn's case, to be even more saturated with it in the near future. Some astrologers choose the keyword consequence to flag the South Node's contribution. How will its participation be felt in the coming retrograde cycles of these heavy hitters, which are arguably conjunct and parallel each other?
Wow, great. That's a very eloquent question for sure. And I think that's very well stated. In other words, you can see it right here in the chart. 20 degrees is the position of Saturn. 22 degrees, as I say, moving backwards is the South Node. So his point was that as these two planets come together, and we were looking at that before in the transits, I guess I won't. Well, I guess I will. So we can say let's take a look at this chart as though it was for the beginning of the year. So we have not 2019 then, but 2020, and we have January. And just randomly, let's look at this particular chart for the early part of January. And now we can see that this time Saturn is not going to station and move backwards. It's going to stay going until it reaches the 1 degree mark of Aquarius, where it will be conjoined with Jupiter. So it's sitting here and moving and catching up to Pluto, and it's only less than around half a degree different. At this point, the South Node has moved away from this situation. But here in the early days of 2020, we do see the perfection of this conjunction that's forming now. So let's just actually revert. Hopefully this will work. Good, so this is back to the actual new moon that we're talking about. So at this point in time, and as time goes by, the South Node will move a little bit further backwards. So we have really a Saturn-Pluto configuration that's both by longitudinal conjunction and by parallel. They're parallel each other, and the South Node is involved. What does this imply? Well, with the South Node, my take on the South Node involvement there is not so much that there's huge consequences. I've heard that before, but I don't really buy it so much. I believe that the South Node has to do with the past. So I believe that having Saturn and Pluto together with the South Node component like this, especially in these particular days, this part of the year versus early 2020 when they actually come together, that this timing right now and as they station for this month of April, with the South Node there. I think that that really goes back to what can we learn from the lessons of the past? Are we destined to repeat the lessons of the past? How many times do we have to go through this before we get it right? Basically, we're talking about the evolution of society because Saturn does represent Capricorn and represent the structure of society. The highest octave of Capricorn is the improvement of the society, how to make the whole thing work. Is there a way that it can be a benefit for everybody involved? So to see Saturn and Pluto, that structural change, that recognition that we're in the midst of this big shift and that we have to respond to it and that we have to change in our individual lives as well. There's a way that the structure of our own lives must necessarily change as a result of this turning of the wheel, this change of the ages that is happening right now with Saturn and Pluto. Each Saturn-Pluto age is a short period, I mean, against the larger backdrop of history, but it is along like a 37-year time, something like that. So, that is, a good chunk of time, 3 or 4 decades. And that is being initiated, a new participation is being initiated. And as we see that beginning part of the initiation of this year, we're seeing the South Node involved at that timing. And I think there is a lot of thought about, haven't we been here before? Haven't we seen this in the 1920s when we saw this huge also imbalance in that case in wealth, the wealth imbalance, which so many people are talking about now as the presidential election shapes up for 2020. The wealth imbalance just seems to be getting more and more exaggerated, and as it does, it kind of strangles things because you don't anymore have the capability of money in the hands of people where they will spend the money is where the economy gets going, and money in the hands not of the people, then the money doesn't get spent, and then it's kind of a recipe for depression. And we did have one in 2008, of course, and now we may be nearing another one, even though the economy is looking pretty good right now. There's signs of strain. So, I think that kind of thing is looking at, actually, we call it a plutocracy when the power is in the hands of the few, right? And Pluto does mean power as well as other things. And Pluto also means oil. I mean, that's not true, actually. Take it back. Neptune also rules oil, and Neptune's involved in these configurations as well. So we have these issues of, the scarcity of resources and how we're going to adjust to that, how the society needs to handle it, needs to modify, and can we get some kind of recognition of the lessons of the past and how they're applicable here, or are we repeating our history? They say history repeats until you get off the record, get off the broken record. Yeah.
Great. Our next question is from Lori. She's here with us on Facebook.
Hi.
How does one interpret the rising sign being the same as the South Node? In parentheses, my past/fallback position, since my North Node is what I should strive for.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, that's an interesting thing because obviously the ascendant has to do with self-development, and the South Node has to do with the past, and the North Node has to do with self-development in that sense. So you have that opposition between the two of them because in this case, the South Node is associated with the first house or the ascendant or identity, sense of identity. So the way that works is you're really going from your South to your North Node in your life. So this would mean that you're very comfortable with who you are. You come in just kind of knowing who you are. And that's not the issue. The issue is to work with others. So the work that you're trying to do, the evolutionary path that you're upon, is to move towards partnership while still obviously retaining your sense of self. And how does partnership enhance your sense of self? It's a little paradoxical, isn't it, to say that by going away from myself, I can become more myself. And yet, there's a lesson there because as we work with other people, we learn more about our own capabilities. We learn in the mirror of relationship who we are, and we learn more how our own development can proceed. So I think that's the situation that particular configuration describes.
Awesome, thank you. Next question is from Debbie. When reading about houses, the interpretation can be basic, such as the second house has to do with one's finances.
Right.
How do we learn about the broader meaning of the houses, such as second house's association with a person's self-esteem? Can you give an example of how the second house, for example, has a broader meaning than just personal wealth or finances?
Well, yeah, astrology is language, and astrology operates on many different levels all at the same time. So it's perfectly true to say the second house refers to finances, and that's one way to read a chart. The thing is, you have to look at each chart as what is the entity that I'm looking at. We can have an entity at a lower stage of evolution. We can have an entity at a very high stage of evolution. And they will mean different things for different people depending on where that person is at. It doesn't have to be the chart of a person. It could be the chart of an institution, the chart of a pet. So, I mean, in each case, you wouldn't want to talk about how your dog is learning to be so articulate in his communication in this lifetime. It might turn out to be a different way of expressing that same notion of communication. So the same thing with the second house. So the second house, yes, can have some esoteric meanings. It is the ground we stand on. It is, we come into this lifetime as a seed, as a identity seed that is considered to be planted in the ground of our environment that we come upon, and that second house represents the environment and the resources that we have to deal with. So there's a lot of very philosophical ways you can look at it, including to see that there's a way beyond materialism, because that materialism is a superficial mistake where we think that by having more toys, as they say, by having a large bank account, by being able to say that we're making six figures, we have this way of claiming authority for ourselves and claiming recognition and self-worth. But actually, as we all know, self-worth comes from things far beyond the material. So that's the point of recognizing a transformation of the second house notion of materialism to be a more spiritual resource where you can be, as they say in the field with the lilies of the field do not labor, why should you? That you have a way of just being in the world and being a happy and fulfilled person in the world, independent of the material situation in which you find yourself. So that's one way to look at that.
Awesome. The next question is from Elaine. What is the meaning of Pluto and North Node conjunct the midheaven?
Well, anytime you have the North Node, you're going to get an emphasis. And anytime you have conjunct the midheaven, you're going to get an emphasis. That's called an elevated planet when Pluto is high in the chart like that. And of course, Pluto in the 10th refers quite specifically to the way in which you try to find your fulfillment in terms of control and power and authority. And with Pluto there, you see the rug get pulled out from under you over and over and over again. And what's the lesson? The lesson is that your power and your authority comes not from external circumstances, not from accolades of the world at large, not from having a large six-figure bank account, as we just spoke of, but having instead your own internal authority, which doesn't depend on externals and does depend on seeing how you can really make manifest what you're brought here to this life in order to manifest. And that is a whole different thing than the plaudits of the crowd. So that's the basic lesson of Pluto in the 10th. And then with the North Node there, this is only accentuated and amplified. And it does involve very specifically a real quest for personal authority, where you have felt in the past you were coming from a place of merger, and you're now finding a place of standing out. You're head and shoulders above the crowd is the way you're gearing yourself in this lifetime, compared to being caught up in the tribal situation and not being independent. Oh, and I've just been informed, and we're almost to the end of the hour, so this is good timing, that that was the last question. I did not know we were running out. I thought there was going to be another one there. Just to reiterate what we have been saying, and maybe I'll switch back to single point of view. So I hope this has been helpful to people. We are living through some very, very difficult times. And, I think they say that this is a good thing. You know, when you're living through difficult times, you're living through interesting times, and you're learning how to grow. And there's a reason that you've chosen this particular time to come in. There's no such thing as a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that you're here right now in this life you're occupying. And it's not even a coincidence that you have a particular difficult, in many cases we have a particularly difficult thing that we have to deal with, and that's something that we can either surmount or we can go under. We can fail to rise to the challenge, or we can just say, by George, I'm going to rise to the challenge. And when we do, we succeed and we grow. And that's why we're here. We're just like a tree. Not so different. You know, we're here to grow and to ascend to the light and to understand from a higher perspective and to get to a place where we're fully integrated and we're fully operational and we're helpful in the way we interact with others in this world. And we're helpful to the world itself, to the nature that surrounds us, to the environment, that we can maintain it and have it be sustainable. So these are all interesting factors, and we are in the midst of a difficult thing of dealing with that situation. And so the question is, how do you respond? You know, how do you look back from the end of your life and say, well, this is what I did. This is the challenge that I was faced with, and this is what I did to meet that challenge, and this is how I did the best I could. And when you can look ahead and feel that that's going to be something that you can relate to and feel good about what you're up to, then you know you're on the right track for yourself. And you have to tune in to what it is that you yourself feel. You know, it's not what anybody else says about what you're up to. It's what you can come up with from the inside. And that's what these planetary archetypes are telling us now too. So, blessed be. Good luck with all that. And we're going through another somewhat difficult month as we, you know, make our way through this pivotal year of 2019, heading into 2020. So, blessings on all of us in our challenge. And see you next time. Have a good time. Take care.